All right, good evening, gentlemen. Get all my coughs out before we get started. So we're back at it, Monday night. Glad to see you guys tonight. It's church history study time. And last week, remember that we've been coming through this transition of the patristic period, which is that first 500 years, and we've now transitioned into what we call the Middle Ages, what would also be called the medieval church, what would be called the Dark Ages. And remember, roughly that's 500 to 1500. And the dates that we start and end that with, the dates that we get for the Middle Ages, they correspond with the fall of Rome. Remember, the West falls first, and it wasn't even really a fall, in a sense. It really just kind of disintegrated. Because remember, in the West, you had Rome, and that side of it kind of disintegrated because as so many other Germanic, tribes and different people groups came into the areas like the Anglos, the Sacs, the Franks, the Huns. We've talked about so many of them. What we now know as, Europeans, the European nations and things, they were all coming in, and Rome just got kind of watered down and mingled in and became, segregated and separated. But the East now, and that was 476, is kind of the official date that the Roman Empire disintegrated. So the East, though, holds up for about another 1,000 years, and in 1453, we have more of a hostile takeover. So they really do fall. And remember, it was the fall of Rome, and who was responsible for that? It was because of the rise of what nation?
Islam.
Good, of Islam. So Muslim armies and Muslim forces began to start to pick away at the Eastern Empire, and to where by the 8th century, so the mid-700s to the late 700s, we have essentially the Muslim nation that we see today was in force and was intact. Okay, Muhammad started all that, and we talked about him several weeks ago. And with the, we're going to get into the Holy Wars, the Crusades were mentioned last week. We'll talk about some of that maybe tonight, maybe next week. But we've transitioned now into the Middle Ages, and a couple significant things that we went through last week was kind of like, I like to call it that drinking from the fire hydrant notion. That's kind of what we had last week. It was a lot of information, a lot of stuff. But again, we're doing a survey, and we're trying to pick and prod and remember really the big points, kind of like in the patristic period. Big point would have been Council of Nicaea, 325, Constantine. Big point would be the thing that changed the landscape. What started the persecution, remember, in the first century on the Christians, remember, was the Great Fire in Rome. Remember that? Who was the emperor at that time? Let's shake our brains up a little bit. Who was the emperor when the fire in Rome started? What year, and who was the emperor?
Nero.
Nero was the emperor. Very good. Anybody remember year-ish?
64.
Yep, 64 AD. Okay, good. How about the fall of the temple, destruction of the temple in Jerusalem? What year was that? We'll play a little trivia. It's fun. When was that? Fall of the temple in Jerusalem would have been
76.
when? Shortly after the fire. It was by one of the Roman. Close. What?
70?
Yeah, 70 AD. Good. And so who was the Roman about to be emperor at the time that happened? Anybody remember? Who was it that came charging in and led that time of destruction in Jerusalem? We have a book in the Bible actually named after a gentleman with the same name. Starts with a T. Good. Titus. Yeah, good. So a lot of those points we try to remember, and that's going back good. You guys did a great job because that's been several months ago now. But the fire of Rome was a big deal, started the persecution on the Christians, in 64 AD. We have in 66, 67 AD, the martyrdom of Paul and Peter, both at the same time there, okay, under Nero. Then we get to 325, we had Constantine, and it shifts dynamics. Remember, now Christianity is legalized. And so now everyone in Rome, remember, has been infiltrating Christianity now. And we've talked about this a lot, and I'm going to lay the foundation a little bit again because of the direction that we're going here, where we see the pagan ideas and pagan practices of the Roman people coming into the church. And like I said, instead of using Zeus or Apollos and the Greek gods and the 12 gods that they worshipped at the time, they just changed those names to St. Peter and to St. Paul and to Mary. And you can see how these things worked. And we talked about the Second Council of Nicaea, and how it was about icons. And I bring this up because we're going to talk about this tonight, more about icons. Remember, idols, but they call it icons, and it's the paintings and the statues, and all those things of the saints and of Mary and all that. And that's how all this crept in, okay? Because everyone who is not actually a believer, not actually Christian in the Roman Empire, has to essentially say they are Christian because they'll be persecuted if they don't. So now all of them are in the quote-unquote Christian church, which there was obviously a real Christian church, but now they're getting inundated with all these bad practices, and that's what starts the slippery slope of where we're going with Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy and all those things. Okay, so last week our big bullet point was that hopefully as we were getting plowed with the water coming out, remember a couple things. 476, there's no longer an emperor in the West, in Rome. Okay, so essentially in Rome, in the West, you have one really church that's kind of claims the head, and remember he's the Bishop of Rome, and he's going to be eventually called the Pope. But the one church had really the authority in the West, which was Rome. In the East, you really had four major churches. Okay, there's many smaller churches, but you had Jerusalem, Antioch, which we talked a lot about both of those in our Acts study. Then you had Alexandria, and you had Constantinople, which remember Rome was the capital in the West, Constantinople was the capital in the East. So Constantinople a major player, but they had four major players in the East. And remember that Pope Leo was the one who was in the West, in Rome, who said, I have authority as the Bishop of Rome over all the churches in the West and over all you churches in the East. And essentially you need to bow and kiss the ring because Peter was the man over Mark. I'm the man over you guys because you're the Church of Antioch. I'm the Church of Rome. We trump you. I'm better than you. Okay, remember that was kind of the Cliff Notes version of that. And so he tried to essentially give authority in that, but the East wasn't having it, and they didn't recognize him as the head of all the churches. They thought they were all on evil playing ground and all that. And so with that, we see a shift that now 476, because there's no more emperor in the West, the Bishop of Rome, okay, being Leo, and then after him, they end up being the authoritative structure in the West. So in the East, for another 1,000 years, you still have all these emperors being leaders. In the West, you have essentially the Pope being the head of the nation and the head of the country, because there is no emperor, okay? So it started with Leo, and now that's the power structure that we see moving forward. So in the West, we're going to talk about popes. In the East, we're going to talk about emperors, okay? So that's essentially what it looks like, and that's where really this mingling and meshing, if you will, that's hybrid of religion and secularism, of politics and religion. That's where the blend comes in, and it's going to matriculate into Roman Catholicism. Okay, so this is the start of it all, the power play that Leo made. Okay, thoughts, questions, or anything on any of that, or anything else before we move on?
Jerusalem, didn't we just say it was in 70?
Good. Let's talk about that. Okay.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Yes. So 70 A.D. Titus comes in. The temple's destroyed, and it really wasn't until about 130, the early 130s, okay, the early 2nd century, that Jerusalem actually completely was taken over, okay? But what happened was, this fall...
Taken over by who? By Romans?
Yes. And so now this fall I'm talking about, they were still able, if you recall too, to live under Roman authority. Right. Even in Jesus' day and such.
Right.
But then the persecution came on them and changed that. Okay, so by the early 2nd century, they were kind of really taken over. But then when this happens, and in 325, when Constantine says it's okay, they can all live in harmony again and such. But now this happens again. So in 637, I'm going to bring this up now because it's going to play a significant role later. This is when the Muslims take over Jerusalem, which we know they still have part of it today.
Yes.
Okay, they did allow, for a time being, they allowed Jewish people to come to Jerusalem and to visit the Holy Land and kind of do their prayers and do their thing as kind of an open door kind of policy, and then they shut that down and they stopped doing that. and that's where we have the Dome of the Rock is there
Is
now.
that when it was built, the Dome of the Rock?
I don't remember what year that's built. Sorry,
Okay.
we'll have to
All right,
look that
no
up.
problem.
But that's what happens is when the Muslims start taking over the East
Yeah.
in the Muslim growth and takeover in 637 is when they
Okay.
actually 638 some scholars say, but right in there 637 638 is when Jerusalem is finally taken by the Muslims. And like I said, by the 700s, excuse me, within 100 years of this, Muslims have got just vast area in all the area we see that they have today, in which obviously today we talked about, they have part of Jerusalem, right? The Jews have some of Jerusalem, and the Muslims have some of Jerusalem. And so that's kind of the big conflict that's been going on since, really since in the womb, like God said it would. Okay, so we just see it on a national scale more and more and more.
Right.
But it was foretold to mommy that in your belly this is what's going to happen. And so, God's word comes true. Yes, sir.
Did the Muslims end up taking over all 4 churches in the East?
No, we will talk about that coming up here shortly. Okay, so some of the churches, still remain, under persecution and all those things even later. Okay, but the reason why I bring this up is because, again, like I said, it will be significant because we're going to start talking about the Crusades coming up here shortly, and this is going to set the tone and the reason for the Crusades coming up, and also it shows the significance of the day and age that we live in, because Jerusalem, when they lost, their national stake there in the 7th century, they don't regain it until the 20th century. So I mean, we're talking 1948, 1947,
Was there
1948.
still people living in Jerusalem, though?
I'm sorry.
Was there still people living,
Sure.
Jewish people living in Jerusalem?
Sure, yeah, sure. There was a remnant of people, and different people groups too would have been living there too. Yeah, so it wouldn't have been recognized. They wouldn't have had the Holy Land as they obviously wanted to have it. And we're going to talk about that's kind of what causes the Crusades when we get to that. But again, the significance of that is that in 1947, 1948, that's when Jerusalem finally became a nation again. And then it wasn't even until like 20 years later, I should say Israel, that's when they became a nation again. Yeah. And then it really wasn't until 20 years later, I think 1967, I think is when Jerusalem, when they actually won back part of Jerusalem, was like 20 years later. Okay.
6-Day War or something.
That's
like
right.
that.
Yep, that's right. Okay, so during this this period of Islamic expansion is what I like to be calling it, this Islamic expansion and by force the things that they're doing. Remember, again, in the 8th century, the Eastern Church, here's what's going to lead up to this. And I'm sorry, let me explain this. Iconoclast controversy. I'm going to define what that means here in just a minute, so bear with me. But during this time frame when the Islamic nation is pushing forward, they're expanding their territories by force, they're gathering up land, they're growing powerful. The church in the East, which is whose land they're taking, okay, the Muslims, remember, are taking over the East, okay? Yeah. So the Eastern Church, like, very good question that you asked a minute ago, because they're losing their land. The Muslims are coming in, they're taking over, and they're starting to wonder, like, what is happening here? Why are we losing all our land? Why is this allowed to happen to the church? Why are all these natives coming in and defeating us in battle? And so essentially, and this happens throughout the course and history of man, that their thought process was, this is God's judgment. See this? Just like Israel, right? What happened to Israel when they went against God? God sent in judgment in the form of other nations and other people groups and other armies to come in and teach them a lesson, if you will, right? Always preserving his remnant and always doing what he was doing through his chosen people. But the rest of them were going to receive the judgment that God had coming towards them. So, no different with the church in the East and the people in the East. They thought that this was divine judgment coming on them. And so they were therefore trying to figure out, why is this coming upon us? Let's look in the mirror and see what is an issue that perhaps is making God unhappy with us. Yeah. And maybe that's the reason that we are losing ground here and being taken over by, remember, a total different religion. Right? We're talking about Muhammad's people, we're talking about Quran, we're talking about Islam full force. Okay, so we're talking about religion of Islam and the people of Islam taking over, the churches and all the land in the east. So they're trying to figure out what happened. Well, this leads them coming up to at least the powers to be. Remember, we still have an emperor in the east. And a lot of these emperors, remember their motivation, even going back to Constantine, who was an emperor over the west, but then also over the whole empire for a short time. And he's the one that, allowed Christians to worship freely and made it kind of legal. And, many people claim that he was converted, but again, I don't believe that. Some people believe he was, some believe he wasn't. I think the fruit, the evidence of his conversion is definitely not there after the fact that he said he was converted. But the point being, God can do whatever he wants to do to shift the climate of the church and those who are persecuting it or those who are helping it. And so he greatly did use Constantine for a period in church there. But their motive, my point is, the emperor's motive, even Constantine's back then, of bringing these councils together. Remember, Constantine didn't really care that half the church thought that it was Trinitarianism that was the belief, and half the church thought that it was Arianism, and all these different ideas that Jesus isn't fully God. This camp says he is. This camp says he's not. The emperor didn't care about that. What the emperor cared about was harmony in his empire, and so he said, "Everybody get at the table, work this out, hash this out, because I want unity. I don't want disunity. I want some harmony in here." And so their motives were always, not the best, but it still shapes what happens, because as we know, as Don alluded to earlier with the elections coming up, tomorrow, that God sets up, right? Let's go right to Romans 13. Who is the one that puts in power and authority is those who are there? God does, okay? So he will use Cyrus, he will use Pharaoh, he will use Darius, he will use, on and on and on with leaders. He will use Obama, he will use whoever he wants to do whatever he wants to, because he's the sovereign God of the universe, and that's what he does. He orchestrates all things, and all things are done for him and by him for his good will. Okay, so whatever the motive is, they look at themselves and they say, well, maybe we have a problem. Maybe God has a problem with us because we have these icons all around, okay, that crept in. Remember, we talked about that already. We've been talking about how they've been doing that, and it crept into the Roman churches from the pagan practices before they turned into a Christian nation, so to speak. Okay, so while most of the church was using these icons, remember, an icon is just a religious thing, these stained glass pictures, the paintings, the statues, the figures, all the things that they would use of the saints, of Mary, of Jesus, of whoever, to worship and to pray to. And they would call it venerating. The church would not say they were worshiping them, but they would say they were venerating them. That means kind of paying them homage, respecting them. And but we know that is just a fine line that was well crossed. Okay, Roman Catholicism, Greek Orthodoxy, all these churches, they do worship. You're praying when you're praying to a saint and praying to Mary and elevating Mary as being a co-mediator with Christ between God and man. You're worshiping. Okay, you've crossed the line a long time ago, in my opinion. So we know that is a problem that they crossed, and a line that they crossed. And the emperor and many are saying, yeah, that's true, and I think that could be the reason that God is judging us, see, and making us lose and letting Islam take over our territory. Yeah. So this word now we're going to define here, iconoclast. Iconoclasts are the ones who were against the practice that the church was having in worshiping idols or icons. So it would be like us, okay? All of us who view that we should not be worshiping idols and praying to Mary, we're iconoclasts, meaning we don't agree with that, okay? And so there were many that opposed such practices as in worshiping idols and worshiping saints and praying to saints and doing all that, which would be what we refer to as the Orthodox view, right? Remember that? What are we talking about when we say the Orthodox view? What am I trying to say? What is my intentions in that? That, hey, the Orthodox view of the church was to not worship icons.
The right view.
Right. The straight and narrow, the main teaching that is a biblical principle that the church believes. The Orthodox view of salvation is that it's by justification in Christ alone. right? It's by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. That's the orthodox view of salvation. Once you start adding anything to that, that's unorthodox, okay? So outside the box. So this worshiping of icons is outside the box of typical mainstream Christianity. And those who are against that are called Iconoclast. Now, yes, sir?
But the Greek Orthodox is the opposite, right? They did believe in...
Well, for a time being, we're talking about both churches now, because we haven't gotten to the split yet. We will. So you have the Western Church and the Eastern Church, but there's still the real Orthodox Church in all these areas. There's still the real gospel out there, and everything that we would be lined up with is still happening. It's starting to get corrupt, as we see with the icons. But there's a mainstream Orthodox Church that is saying, we don't do that. We're not with that. Okay, but the gap is going to get a lot bigger, and we're going to talk about why. It's coming up soon. It's following this Iconoclast controversy. Because, look, the ones who are against worshiping idols are called iconoclasts. The ones who are for it are called iconoduals. Okay, so you have these two groups, and essentially, I know we're not going to remember those names, and by next week. I won't remember in a few months probably, but iconoclast is the Orthodox view. Those are us that view we should not worship idols. Okay, the iconoduals are the ones who want to worship that, and here's their grounds for it. They try to use the Bible, as we always do, and as all those who are trying to teach even false things do. But the Bible does say, okay, in Colossians 1 and maybe around verse 17 or 18, but also in Hebrews 1, it says that Jesus Christ is the express image of the invisible God. So, and essentially Paul uses that argument to people too. And remember, even in Acts, when he went to Athens and he saw all the statues and all the icons, there's your perfect view. Remember in the Acts study that we just came out of, all the statues, all the icons, all the things that he saw there, he's like, man, I can see you're a religious bunch, right? And he says, and look at that one right there that says to the unknown God, right? And he goes to the gospel right from there. But that's the point, is that Paul even uses later and says, you want to worship an idol and an icon, and you want to worship this thing that you can visualize, and that's what a lot of people groups do, and that's how we define God without God revealing the truth to us. Is Romans 1 and 2, we worship the creature more than the creator. We do the things that we know we do without God. And so that's what's happening, and their view is saying, well, like Paul said, that the image of God that you're supposed to worship is Jesus Christ. He is the express image of God, because no one has seen God, and you can't see God. And Jesus is the God that you are to worship. See what I'm saying? But they took it too far, see what I mean? And tried to justify their view on, well, now we've got statues of all the saints and the apostles, and we're going to pray to each one of them. See what I mean? You're going too far. You're taking it beyond the scriptural parameters if you have sound hermeneutics, like we always talk about, okay? So they would try to use that to defend it. And again, say that they're, I referred to this a minute ago, but to say that they were venerating them, again, just holding them in high esteem and reverencing them. But, that's a real fine line. And clearly, we can look at, the churches now and to see what they've become, and we know that they're not just respecting them. I mean, they're worshiping them, they're praying to them, they're elevating them in a place that they shouldn't be elevated, and the Bible says that none should be elevated. Okay, and that leads to, again, Eastern Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism that we see today. Obviously, both of them do that, okay, with their stained glass, with their pictures, with their statues,
I came from a Catholic background. I mean, there was a virgin that you prayed for every particular thing. If you were in this situation, you prayed for this one because they had delivered, they had seen a vision of this virgin when they were fishermen,
Good.
And they revered that virgin, and it was idolized.
Exactly, and that's all it is. They call it icon. They called it icons back in the councils and things, and we would call them idols. Same thing. Yeah, they just call them icons, but that's all it is. They're obviously turning them into idols. Okay, so let's see where this leads. We know it's not going to be to a good place. But in 726, we have this emperor. Remember, we talked about Leo already. But here's an Emperor Leo the Third, and he's in the east. Okay, the other Leo was in the west. And a lot of these guys you will find actually, it's funny, but I'm just going to say this so we're kind of all on the same page with this. A lot of these guys you're going to see similar names. There's going to be a lot of Leos, a lot of Gregorys, a lot of first, second, fifths, and on and on and on with the numbers, because a lot of them wouldn't have been their names. Leo the Third's real name wasn't Leo, but they would take the names of men that had very significance as emperors, kind of like the Herods. There's lines of kings and lines of pharaohs. Okay, not every man that led Egypt's name was Pharaoh. You understand that?
Right.
Pharaoh is the title of who he is. Same with Abimelech, with the Philistine kings through the Old Testament, and again in the New Testament with the Herods. We've talked about in Matthew, and as we're preaching through Mark and through Acts, we saw, there's Herod Agrippa and Herod Antipas and Herod Agrippa II, but they were all called Herods. Okay, same thing with these guys. They would rename themselves after someone that they thought, and the popes actually do the same thing.
Yeah.
How many Pope Pauls are there? Lots. Because what they do is the first Pope Paul is they view him as, hold him in such high esteem that they, say he was great at missions. They want to be known for missions, and so they'll say, I'm Pope John II. See what I mean? They'll attach their term of their office to a name that they revere and regard in high esteem. So anyways, with that being said, there was an emperor named Leo the Third. And remember, anytime we say emperor at this point, we're talking about the East. Because in the West, in 726, is there an emperor? There's not. There's a pope. Okay? So he ordered that icons be replaced. In fact, this is where it started. In Constantinople, which would be one of the main churches there, that the emperor was head over the east. So he had an icon that was outside of the palace there at Constantinople. He had it taken down and removed, and he had it replaced with a cross. And this was a statement from the emperor himself saying, we're getting rid of the icons because why? Because I feel the icons are the reason that God is judging us, and we're going down to the Muslims because you guys are all idol worshippers. And though I'm not even a believer and I don't care about that, I think that's what's happening, and you guys can no longer worship idols. Wow. See it? That's what's going to happen. So he thought that was the reason. He bans icons, and now in the East, you are not allowed to have icons and to worship icons because he thinks that's going to help change the tide. Okay? Funny thing is it actually did for a short time. They actually gained back some land, but then it goes back again the other way.
But he replaced it with
Sure.
a cross, a different icon.
Could be, right, could be, but I don't know why he did it. It's just that he wanted to maybe keep something and appease the people, perhaps is one train of thought, or that maybe people wouldn't worship that, hopefully, as an icon, although we know that people do, still even with the cross today. Okay? Now, in the West, I want you to understand at the same time, and again, here's another look. See what I'm saying? Gregory II. Just there's going to be more Gregorys, more Leos than we keep track of. But in the West now, the Pope over there condemns Leo's thought and Leo's actions. So catch the line here. Here's the thing to catch. The East is worried because the Islamic nation is taking over, and they say, well, God's judging us because we're worshiping idols. Let's stop worshiping idols. The West is run by the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, and that church is getting well grounded with icons and worshiping idols. And he says, we're not listening to that over there, because remember, he thinks he's an authority over all of them anyway. Yeah. The Pope thinks he's over all those churches, and he's saying, what Leo's doing over there is wrong. We are supposed to worship and venerate icons, and we're not going to stop doing that in the West. See what I'm saying? And that's now, the West is going to become Roman Catholicism. You understand?
They're making it up.
Their worshiping of icons and all that thing is never going to go away. And he says, we're not doing it. I don't care what they're doing over there. Yeah. So in the East, they stop doing it. In the West, they do not stop doing it. And now you're going to start to see there's going to be a big division coming up in the East and West, even more than we've seen. Then there's going to be some harmony and coming together, and then breaking up in division again. Okay? So that's what it's going to look like. But I'm just giving you guys a couple seconds here to catch up with your notes.
When did they start using the term Pope?
Good question. So we've talked about it a couple times, but remember, it's not going to be until we get to, I believe it's the Fourth Lateran Council is what it's called. It's in 1215. So not till the 13th century where all that's going to start. But then they go back and say that all the bishops of Rome were popes. But the pope terminology doesn't get used till 13th century. And so last week we talked about how I'm just going to go ahead and use it because we know the term that we're thinking of, but we keep going back and forth between Bishop of Rome and Pope, but it's the same interchangeable office to them. So they didn't start calling it the papacy till the 1200s. What they would call it to this point still is the Bishop of Rome. But the authoritative structure that the Bishop of Rome had is what we call the papacy, and that's what they call it. So they would go all the way back, obviously, to Peter, which we know to say that, those were all the popes in succession, and we talked a lot about that last week. And we're going to talk actually about it more here in a moment, too. Okay. Good question. Okay, so check this out now. Now in the East, no icons, no idols. But, there's always a but. However, that was Leo III. See this? Another one. Leo IV. Okay, there's going to be a Leo V. We're going to talk about it in a minute too. But the big point idea here is that Leo dies, and his wife takes over power with her son. And this was a popular thing that would happen a lot. When the son would come into power, the mother would be deemed, to have the power with him, the consent, because, in effect, she was the queen, or being the wife of the emperor and the mom of the new one coming in. So the moms at that time would have a lot of power, and a lot of them used it. And in fact, some of them would kill the son and try to be the emperor themselves. We see that through the Old Testament with kings and queens and nonsense that happens with power struggles with humans. So his wife, Irene, takes power, and she reinstates icons. And she says, oh, we're worshiping the idols. Let's bring back all the idols that we were just hiding in our closets and under the couch and stuff, and let's bring them all out and display them everywhere. And I'm all about icons, and that's who we're going to be again, and we're going to do that again. Okay, so she reinstates icons. And how she does it is, this ties back a little bit. Again, we don't need to remember all the details and all these things, but we already talked about these 7 ecumenical councils, and those 7 what we would call worldwide councils. The first one being the Council of Nicaea in what year?
325.
Good, 325. Council of Nicaea being the first one. The second Council of Nicaea is the last of the 7, and that's in 787 when this is happening. How she does it is she calls a council. And this is the last of the ecumenical councils. There's East and West representation there. And the Orthodox Church stayed out of this council totally, because all the council was called over was to talk about, are we going to venerate icons or not? So essentially, are we going to worship idols or not? And so the Orthodox Church that knew you don't worship idols never even went to the council. So all the people that are in the council from the East and the West are, the iconodules, the people that believe we should worship idols. So, of course, the outcome is we should worship idols. We're having a meeting of alcoholics. Should we drink or shouldn't we drink? Of course we all want to drink, and let's toast to that, So, of course, it comes through that they affirm and reinstate icons officially in the East. Remember, in the West, it was never denounced. In the West, he said, oh, we're worshiping them anyway. I don't care. So now they're all worshiping them again, and it kind of brings a little more unity again. That, oh, okay, we're like-minded with them again. They're going to worship our false idols and our statues, so we're all good with them again. So, look at this back and forth. Here's Leo V, a few years later. The next Leo comes into power as emperor, and he is an iconoclast, like his grandfather, and says, no more worshiping idols. So now, no worship idols. He dies, yes, let's worship idols. Then his son comes to the throne, no, let's not worship idols. Again in the East, okay? And again, his motivation was the same as his grandfather's, that he saw his people losing and dying and losing their land to the Muslims, and thought the same thought that was passed down from his granddaddy, that we shouldn't be worshiping idols because God's mad at us, and that's what's happening, is divine judgment. Okay? So guess what happens again? I'll take a pause there if you want to get all these names for your notes, but just significantly funny to me to see that it happens twice. It just happens 2 times, and it's crazy because look what happens. So it's banned again by Leo V for quite some time, but not too long because look, his grandson, Leo V's grandson, Theophilus, when he dies, so Leo V is an iconoclast, his son is an iconoclast, which means no more worshiping idols. Okay, for Leo V, for his son, and his son. But now, that guy's name is Theophilus, and when he dies, you don't have to remember all the names, here's the point. He dies, and his wife, Theodora, with her new son who's going to take over power, well, she's an iconodule, and she worships idols, and now she says again, break out the icons, bring them back out from their sacks, and let's go back to town of worshiping idols. So, in only a couple generations, you have here a woman who's the wife of the emperor who says, don't worship idols. He dies, and she says, bring them all out. And then it happens again.
Yeah.
So it's just, history repeats itself, but it's kind of funny. But I just wanted to put all that in there because it's crazy how this all goes and see where it's going to go. Yes, sir.
What do we think it's like 30, 40 years in between all these changes? Like each generation, I'm just wondering,
Several, because this is Leo V's grandson, and it was a
Right,
couple
that one skipped a
generations
couple.
before that the other one happened. So, it
Like
had been a
100
few
years.
generations of emperors, certainly. It was Leo III. So,
like life expectancy is probably like 50 years or something.
well, especially, we're going to see it could be a lot shorter than that because of all the
30 to
hostile
50
takeovers and
So a couple generations, so you're looking at 100 years, 150
yeah, so it's not too long of a time. Okay, so now icons are officially reinstated into the Eastern Empire, and now I want you to understand. Now is the time that it's going to be officially reinstated and remain. Okay, so now, which leads to Eastern Orthodox Church today. They still worship icons and venerate icons in their wording, just like the Roman Catholic in the West. Eastern Orthodoxy in the East, they all are about icons, and they're all good with it, okay? And that remains forever. But there was this little controversy here in the 8th century where it went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And because, again, that they thought divine judgment was upon them, and they just went up and down with that. And we see them getting, it seems like, good direction, and then right back off track again. Then, maybe we can get on track again, and nope, right back off track again. And then again, they stay off track.
Did the icons change during these shifts, or they just brought back the same old?
Certainly, I'm sure they added to things along the way, but essentially, we're talking about what turns into the apostles that they would call the saints.
Yeah.
So the saints, Mary, and really, all the saints that they use aren't even apostles. They have saints who aren't
So
apostles.
you had Francis of Assisi and Augustine.
Right,
All of these
lots of
people came after this, but they're still.
Well, notice the
revered.
one he just said, because we talked about him already, St. Augustine. And actually, St. Augustine, Florida, is named after him,
Yeah.
which is Augustine, because that's what I call him. That's what they call him, St. Augustine.
Right.
But actually, it's Augustine,
Yeah.
and that we've already talked about him from the 5th century. And
Yeah.
so he is one of the ones that we hold in high esteem because he was an Orthodox, devout, church leader, which will be post-Nicene, after 325. He was in the 430s, 450s. And we hold him with high regard. He was probably, in that time period, of the patristic period, I would say no one of greater influence in the church than Augustine. The funny thing is, the Catholic Church would say the same thing, and they call him St. Augustine.
St. Augustine,
Yeah.
yeah.
And they think that he's on their side. It's the funny thing. But through all the things we've studied and talked about, just like they claim Peter was and so was, none of them were. Augustine had nothing to do with what you say he
Exactly.
did.
Exactly.
Which saint was it where if you bury him upside down in the yard, it helps you sell your house fast
Or
or
something
something
like
like
that.
that? Serious, it's true.
It was crazy, yeah.
Crazy stuff, bro.
Crazy stuff.
So, wrapping up that point, The Second Council of Nicaea, we've already talked about this, but we're in that time frame now, the 8th century. That's when this happens. It solidifies the Eastern stance on icons, and because of that, we see some reunification in the church in the West and the East, because now, okay, we're all on the same page. We all like icons and worship icons. We can all be friends now again. Okay? No division over that, which is, you can see what a major thing that is to them now. You see that? They were dividing because they want to worship idols and we don't, or the icons. And now that we're all worshiping them, okay, we can all be friends again. But still remember, the big split, and we're going to talk about that shortly, until 1054. So we're in the late 700s. And so look here, coming up in not even 200 years, we're going to have the Great Schism, which is the final ultimate divide in the East Church and the West Church. And that's when you're going to have Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodox. And they're apart and they're separated to never be, together and reunited again. Okay? And again, we'll talk more about the Great Schism in 200 more years. So maybe next week. Okay, so remember, we're talking about the Middle Ages. And we are in the first half of the Middle Ages. I've told you before, the Middle Ages, 500 roughly. Remember the dates, 500 to 1500. So 1,000 years is the Middle Ages. It's divided at the 1054 mark. That's, okay, so remember, patristic period, what's our main, boom, we put our stake on what year? In the first 500 years, what's the big point to remember?
325.
325, good. Council of Nicaea, Constantine, no more persecution in the church. And we kind of talk around all that. Middle Ages now, our stake point in the division in the early Middle Ages and the late is going to be 1054 and the Great Schism. And we're going to talk about that, which is that division I was just talking about. That's going to be the dividing point of the Middle Ages. So you have essentially, 500 to 1,000 and then that schism, and then 1,000 to 1,500. See, so we're still keeping it in bite-off chunks. 500 years patristic, 500 for the early Middle Age, 500 for the late Middle Age, and then we'll get into Reformation and Awakening and all those things afterwards. Okay, so I want to bring up a thing here that will be of some significance in our discussions going forward, particularly next week. Again, 8th century, 732, we have what's called the Battle of Tours. A man named Charles Martel is the leader of the Franks. We've talked about them a little bit because they will become France. The Franks is France, okay? So they become a nation, and they're part of the settlers that came into the Western Empire and took over, just by being there, and have their own land in the West. Okay, now, he and his armies hold off and defeat Muslim armies and Muslim nations. We haven't seen that up to this point.
In France?
Yeah, keeping them out of their territory, okay, and forcing them to retreat exactly from what we would call like France.
Yeah.
So their armies keep them from pushing through there, and that's significant because up to this point we really haven't seen anyone be able to stop Muslims moving in. Okay, so Martel and the Franks are able to do that at this time, and that's going to be significant now. I'm going to try to unpack a little bit tonight why. Because while in the East now, they're arguing about these icons. Are we going to worship idols? Are we not going to worship idols? Are we going to do this? Are we not going to do this? While all that's happening in the East, in the West, the Pope is kind of using his brain and the authority and the power again, trying to unite and make an alliance with the Franks, because the Franks have become the powerful peoples in the West. Okay? So think of France, and maybe not think of them as we do today or whatever, but at the time, the Franks were the powerful people, and they were the ones defending off the Muslims, and so it would be good to be friends with them, yes? Yeah. So the Pope, and the Church and the Bishop of Rome and the people of Rome were making allegiances and alliances with the Franks, knowing that they were the ones that were capable of withstanding Muslim forces, and so we want to be allies, obviously, with them. Okay? Now, perhaps some of us have heard of Charlemagne. popular name of a lot of these names that we've been talking about, excuse me, as emperor. And this was in 800, Christmas Day 800. Pope Leo III. There we go with more Leos, right? This is significant. Catch this because of our conversation last week and the last few weeks. But, and if you go and Google this is like a big deal in Catholicism. It's a big deal in church history. To bring up Charlemagne, that's actually why that name is known. Okay, because Charlemagne, okay, is Charles Martel that we just talked about. Charles Martel's grandson is this Charles, and that's what Charlemagne means. The name Charlemagne is Latin, and it means Charles the Magnificent. Charlemagne, okay? Charles the Great, Charles the Magnificent, and its Latin version is Charlemagne. So this Charles the Magnificent, this Charlemagne, is actually crowned as emperor, because remember last week we talked about in the West it had been dissolved in 476. Now come the 800, in the late 700s, we saw the Franks and the Anglo-Saxons and these people groups coming together to form an alliance, which becomes called the Holy Roman Empire. And that's what we're talking about now. The Pope in the Holy Roman Empire goes and crowns Charlemagne, and think of the power here, because his grandfather was Charles Martel the Frank, who stood off the Muslims, and we want to be a part of them.
Yeah.
So now the Pope goes to his grandson and says, I have the authority to crown you and make you emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. And go and Google it, you'll see an icon, actually, like a painting and a drawing of this. It's hugely popular, of the Pope crowning Charlemagne. You'll even see that going back to Constantine. We're talking about 325. Constantine was seen to have kind of been given the authority at that time by the Bishop of Rome. Okay, but this is significant here because you now see the Pope lording that authority and showing that he has the authority, that I'm the one as the Pope who is going to say he's qualified and call him to be and crown him to be emperor. And for the next 700 years, the emperors in the Holy Roman Empire are going to be selected and crowned by the Pope. See that? The Pope is the authority over the emperor. Remember what we talked about the last couple weeks, and seeing the direction that this is going, starting with that first Leo and getting the recognition of the head of all the churches is me, the Bishop of Rome, and there's no more emperor, and the last emperor we had gave me the authority to be in charge. So now the next Pope takes that, the next Pope takes that, the next Pope takes, they all take that power struggle, which we still have today. Okay, so they still have authority, that they say is apostolic succession and came down from Peter, that Jesus, remember, gave him the keys to the kingdom, and now he's passed it on to me and to him and to him and to him. And now we see this in full force now, you guys. That's significant. Think about that. What we're talking about, like today's age, would be a pastor being the president. Okay? And then a pastor, thing is, we don't have that hierarchy in our Orthodox church of, a one-man pastor leading the church like they do. So it's kind of hard for us to wrap our brain around. But the Pope, the Bishop of Rome, the leader of the Roman Church, is the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, and he's the one who gets to put in the leader and the person in charge there, and kind of be his mouthpiece. Okay, so that's pretty significant. And we've been talking about how that's been matriculating up to what we see today, and the authority that comes with the papacy. The influence and the power of that position has been going on for quite some time. And now, just a quick note, Holy Roman Empire really was just an attempt. It was kind of like the UN or the EU. It was them pulling together these people groups and just trying to resurrect the empire. Because remember, the empire in the West had been fallen for hundreds of years. So it's their attempt to kind of really resurrect that and have a Roman Empire again. Okay, so it does happen, and it goes on for for quite some time. But that's really what happened. In that, see the significance of the Pope and the authority, and again the hybrid and the blending and the mixing and the coming together of the church and state, the coming together of politics and religion, the coming together of the Pope and the Emperor, sharing, the seat, so
That was
to speak.
predominant during the Middle Ages, right?
That's right, and that's where it's going to lead to them having the power and the authority that we're going to see moving forward. When we unfold and unpack what happens in the next couple centuries moving forward, this is all the groundwork for why we're going to see what happens. Okay, so that's why it's important for us to recognize.
The difference is, like, the Pope, every time he made a command or did something, that he did it all in the name of God. Like, oh, God wants this.
And
God
people
wants that.
believed, remember, that he was doing that it was apostolic tradition, that his word is infallible. His word is
to this day,
authoritative. Yeah,
Even to this day.
that's right. That is authoritative. So it's not just scripture that we would say as the Orthodox Church. The scriptures are the ultimate and final authority. They would say, yes, they are an authority, but they also would say that the traditions, that apostolic tradition, which means handed down from pope to pope to pope from Peter, everything that they've ever put into play is just as authoritative as that. Which is why, when we get to 1215 and 13th century, we start to see the definitions of Roman Catholicism, which we talked about in the beginning of the study a long time ago, of their works-based faith, their works-based salvation. Okay, make no mistake. Go and look on Wikipedia, go look on Catholicpedia, whatever you want to look at later tonight, and go see what they believe saves you is going to be Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodoxy. They're all going to be on the same thing. They will say, yes, you believe in Jesus. Like you said, we believe in Jesus, yes. But you also, it's through baptism. It's also through catechisms. It's also through all the tradition and works and doing the penance and all the things that they've added to it, they believe are wrapped up in and with believing. See that? With faith, also all that other stuff has
And
to be
there's
done.
no clarity. I mean, you can ask Catholics from
Yeah.
diverse groups, and there's no clarity as to what they need to do to be saved or not.
Yep.
Was it confession, communion, what?
Right. But that'll be their thing, because it's going to be, they'll say by faith, yes, but they'll also say you must
Yes,
follow
you must.
sacraments, and
Yeah.
you must, do all the things that they believe and that they
It's
say.
very confusing.
Yep. Again, works-based. Works-based. Okay, so we talked about this enough. It's no longer, the papacy, remember the Pope, it's no longer just a religious office. It's now a political office. Okay? And this is going to lead to mass corruption that we see big time. Okay? The funny thing is, let me check my notes real quick. Sorry, let me go ahead here and see. That may be a good stopping point. Well, we've been talking about it, so I want to finish with it. We've been talking about this apostolic succession, and tradition that they claim coming from pope to pope to pope, starting at Peter and being handed down, and we have the authority, and from God to be his mouthpiece, essentially, to the church. And so in this time, in the Dark Ages, Middle Ages, 8th, 9th century got really bad. Really bad. I was studying a lot of that a couple weeks ago, so it's kind of fresh on the brain. That there was struggle and battle over the papacy, over being the Bishop of Rome. Kind of like you see through the Old Testament with the kings, how there'll be a king that ruled for 3 months, and he was killed and taken over by another king. And he lived for about 6 months, and he was killed, and then another king, the guy that took him. That's exactly what happens with the papacy in the 8th and 9th century. There's so much lying, so much deception. In fact, in a 120-year time span, this is important. You can look this up if you want to look more into it. But from 880 to 1000, so 8th, 9th century, or 9th going into 10th century, it's pretty crazy. There was a 1-year time span where there were 4 popes.
Wow.
There was, over that 100-year span, there was 30 popes who reigned for less than 2 years. So you got high turnover in this revolving door of the papacy. And the problem is, it's because everyone wants the authority to be the Pope. So follow this logic with me. Oh, and this is the name of a book if you want to look it up. I didn't read it. I know of it from the guy who, this class that I took. It's called The Bad Popes by Chamberlain. And here's the problem. So the Pope who takes over, he usually took over in this time span because he killed the Pope who was there and took his place. Or he had the Pope who was there excommunicated and denounced so that he could take his place. So follow my logic here. Follow the train of thought. This is hugely problematic when it comes to apologetics for Roman Catholics saying that there's been apostolic succession from Peter and that tradition and authority has been passed down by God, they say, from each pope to the next pope. Do you see the information that I just gave you, what the problem is? What's the problem with that train of thought?
The humans are killing humans. I mean, the people are killing each other.
Okay, so if Izzy's killing me to take over my office, not only am I not appointing him to do it, he's doing it against my will and taking my life to do it. And so by no means, in no way am I passing down apostolic baton of authority and leadership to the succeeding pope. See what I'm saying?
Yep.
They're taking it by force hostilely against the man that they're taking it from, which cuts off the line of any kind of succession that they want to claim.
Yeah.
Do you see that? For over 100 years that happens. And so that's a very difficult thing for them to obviously discuss. And a lot of them won't even be armed with understanding and knowing that time period. And because, most of us are ignorant about the church, Roman Catholics are ignorant about their church history too, and don't know a lot of that. And I would say, just for discussion's sake, their argument that I've heard would be probably, if you went to talk to someone about this, a Roman Catholic, say a priest or a bishop, or a cardinal or somebody that would know what they think they know on the topic, they would also say this about the papacy, that the office of the papacy is higher than any man who fills that position. So, kind of like how the presidency should be here. We could look back on presidents and say, he wasn't a very good guy. He wasn't a very good president. But the office of presidency is still held in high esteem and high regard. See what I'm saying? And still has that position of high esteem, no matter who was in it. And they would say the same kind of argument for the papacy, that through all of that, God was still orchestrating it all and keeping the office of the papacy where it is, in spite of bad men being there. See what I'm saying? That would probably be the argument on the other side. I just figured I'd give you that because I'm hoping in what we just said that some of the wheels were turning, maybe saying like, what would they even say? How could they answer that? I would think that that's probably what they would say.
Say the Lord works in mysterious ways.
Amen. Right? Well, let's close there as we always do. Let's close with some application. Let's close with the recap of the bullet points. Middle Ages, we see in the separation coming, we see the icons, we see some reuniting, but we see the problem that's going to cause, leading up into next week's discussion, the problem that's going to cause the great schism and the total divide in the East and West is this Pope, this papacy, this authority that he's claimed and this authority that he has. And it's going to lead to mass corruption in the West. There's going to be many problems also in the East. But let's not lose sight of this. All the difficulties, all the struggles, all the problems, all the darkness, as we're talking about tonight, of the Dark Ages, which is why it's called the Dark Ages. Make no mistake, it was a dark period of time. But also make no mistake that we serve a God that's bigger than all that. And that He, and He alone, is the one, as we've discussed all through this, has preserved the gospel. He and He alone is the one who has been building His church from the beginning and still continues to do so. And He can do it through anything He wants to do, and do it and accomplish it however he wants to do it. So in all the icons and all the power struggles and killing and lying and all the things that we're talking about now, don't lose sight of the fact that through all of that, there's still an Orthodox remnant of a church. Okay? Up to this point, we have Roman Catholicism entrenched in our society and in our brain, and like I told you, we'll get to it more in the 13th century, but to this point right now, in the 800s to 1000s, where we're at right now, they still are believing, at least I get the icons and the idols and all that's bad, but in essence, they have the gospel of how you're saved, so the justification of being saved is still the Orthodox Church believing that it's by faith alone in Jesus Christ. So don't miss that there's still the Orthodox, true, the scarlet thread of Jesus through the Bible. He's kept it through the church in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and he's going to, until he calls an end to this thing, he's going to continue to do that. And so he did it all through this darkness, and yeah, dude, it's gonna be really dark, and we're gonna see how bad it gets, which is going to lead us to what? The Reformation.
Yeah.
Understand? You're starting to see now and taste now, I hope, why the Reformation was such a blessing and so necessary, and why a lot of us, are reformed in our theology, and why we go back to the giants of the Reformation, and yes, the early patristic period, but then also, Augustine and Athanasius and people we've talked to, but going back to Luther and Calvin and John Huss and, Wycliffe and just on and on and on with names of reformers, because you're starting to see why Reformation was necessary and why we should praise God that he did a work in the lives and the hearts of men like Luther and Calvin that led us to what we at least have the freedoms to do today. And that gospel, the pure gospel, of grace alone, but faith alone, and Christ alone, there was saved and preserved through this time where it would be, to men, a very bleak and dire time that it never would make it. Well, it did make it because God knows what he's doing, and he continues to build the church as he promised he would, and so we're starting to get a little taste of that. Yes, sir? Yeah, let's close there. Thoughts, questions?
So, I know we're not to the Reformation time period yet, and we'll probably learn a lot more about it then, but whenever this Reformation...
I hope we do.
Yeah. Whenever this Reformation happened, I see, everything being surrounding about the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church, but then you have the remnant of little Orthodox Church that is the good stuff. And whenever the Reformation happened, they're basically... He's nailing something up on a Catholic Church's door, correct?
Essentially, yes.
Right? And so he's trying to reform.
95 somethings to be exact.
Yeah. So he's nailing that on the Catholic Church, and then reform happens to the Catholic Church. How's that lead back to
Well, I would just tell you,
Christian
reform
Church?
doesn't happen to the Roman Catholic Church.
Okay.
What we call it, what's really called the Protestant Reformation.
Okay.
Because think of Protestant meaning protest.
So it's where they start to branch off away from the Catholic
They're
Church.
protesting and standing against the darkness that we're talking about that has become the church at Rome.
Okay.
And they're saying,
So part of them
we go to the scriptures and you're wrong. And that's what they're saying. And he writes, 95 Theses is what he nails to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. And that was a big deal because that was 95 places and things that he said, wrong,
Majorly
wrong,
majorly
Bible, scripture, wrong. Here's why you're wrong on this, here's why you're wrong on this. Here's 95 of them, and nails them to the door. Was, a big deal. And dude, look, they excommunicated him. We'll get there. But they wanted to kill him. He had to go in hiding with a friend who, it was told that kidnapped him, and so no one knew where he was because the Roman Catholic Church wanted to kill him. It's a big deal. Yeah, it's a big deal. And not just him, many. Yeah.
So then the little Orthodox churches that were the remnant, that they started coming out of the closet, basically.
Sure, yeah, more and more men, like you said, that God put on their hearts exactly what he put on Martin Luther's You know, like I said, it wasn't one man, and it was. We're talking all about the pre-reformers. I mean, there were many men before Martin Luther, okay, that started this whole thing, and because they were blessed and able to, and fortunate enough to have scriptures that they could get their hands on and read, and start, and that's where all the translating starts. Martin Luther translates into Greek, and you know, we go to Gutenberg and the printing press, and just the whole thing that we'll get into eventually. You know, of how these things are going to be translated back into the languages so people can get their hands on Bibles. Again, going back to the Bible as the authority. And actually, the funny thing is, what changed all that in Luther's life was Romans. The study we're doing right now, I think it was chapter 1. That was essentially like the big driving force on him. That just God opened his eyes right then and there. And we'll talk about it. He was a monk, and his whole testimony is amazing. But the point is, God opened his eyes and many others that he had prepared this work, like Ephesians 2:10 says. He prepared a work for them to do ahead of time that they did, and we need to be very, very grateful that they did. Good. Yeah, we'll get there. We'll unpack a lot more of it, but that's a good understanding and a good foundation, a good start. Cool. Any other thoughts, comments? All right. Good stuff. I'm shutting